This town has a secret that locals don't talk about. There are towns in America that look peaceful from a distance, where porches sag with old rocking chairs and flags fade in the sun, where roads bend around maple trees and creeks spin under steel bridges. You pass through, you buy coffee, you nod at the clerk, and you move on. Then there are places that hold the air a little too still, places where conversations stop the second you step inside, places where people learn to live by a rule that is never written down. Do not speak about it. Do not ever speak about it. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I found one of those places on a gray afternoon in late October. A road sign with peeling paint pointed left toward a town called Dunsmuir. The letters were cracked and flaking, like they had been trying to slide off the wood for years. The road narrowed and tunneled under trees. A river ran beside it, dark and quick, and an old steel bridge took me over with a hollow clang. Past the bridge, the town appeared, set low in a pocket of hills. There was a diner with a roof that once had been red, a gas station with a gleaming new pump that looked strange beside the rusted canopy, a church at the edge of town, pale and sunburnt, its doors wrapped in chain. It was 4 in the afternoon when I pushed into the diner. The bell over the door clinked and kept swinging for longer than felt normal. The place smelled like coffee and fryer oil and lemon cleaner. The booths were covered in vinyl that had split in quiet little lightning bolts. A woman behind the counter looked up, nodded, and poured coffee without a word. She had a soft face and heavy eyes. A clock above her said 4:18. The second hand twitched and hesitated as if it needed permission to keep going. I asked how far it was to the next town. The woman said, "You can get there if you keep the river on your right." I asked if there was a motel nearby. She said there is one by the feed store. I asked about the church with the chains on the door. She looked at the clock. She wiped a clean spot on the counter that did not need wiping. Then she said, "The door is not for you." She smiled, a tiny smile that had no warmth, and poured more coffee I did not ask for. The bell over the door clinked again, and I realized I was the only person in the room. At 5:30, the sky turned early dark, the way it does in hill towns where the sun slides behind the ridge and leaves the streets in blue shadow. I checked into the motel by the feed store. The clerk slid a key across the counter and kept his hand on it for a moment. He spoke without looking up. "Curtains closed by 10, lights off by 11, no music after midnight. If you hear the bell at 3, stay inside." He did not explain what bell. He did not ask for a signature. When I asked about a receipt, he tore a piece of paper from a pad and wrote a number with a slow, careful hand. The pen scratched loud in the quiet room. The room smelled like dust and laundry soap. The blanket was heavy, the kind of weight that feels like a hand. There was a card on the nightstand that listed the rules again. Curtains closed, no whistling after dark. If the television turns on by itself, do not look at the screen. It was printed with a smudged stamp that had bled red into the paper. I slid the card under the lamp and tried not to think about it. Dunsmuir carried an odd rhythm. Streets got noisy and then fell silent, not in a way that matched traffic or business hours, but like the town breathed out and then held its breath. People moved with purpose near sunset, carrying boxes to porches and hanging wind chimes that never moved. I passed the general store and saw a shelf of chalk and twine beside a display of canned peaches. I saw jars of salt stacked higher than coffee. An old man pulled a crate toward the door and stopped when he saw me. He had that same tired look, like sleep had become only a habit. He nodded once. Then he said, "Late day is not a good time for walking. Keep to the motel after dark." His voice was low and even. He did not sound afraid. He sounded practiced. Near 6:30, I heard the first sound of the bell. It was not a bright church bell. It was a low iron sound that rolled across the street and into my chest, the way thunder travels under a floor. It rang once and stopped. A few seconds passed, then it rang again. I counted 7 slow strikes. The sound came from the direction of the church that wore chains like a necklace. The bell rang, and every porch light in town flickered at the same time. Not off, not on. A shiver in the filament, a warning tapped on glass. The church sat beyond a narrow field, set aside from the last corner of houses. Its shingles were curled and black. The cross on the roof leaned like it was tired. The doors were chained with a padlock the size of a hand. The vestibule window had been painted over, but I could see the shape of pews inside, gray rows like ribs. Someone had slid a length of metal through the chain as if to add weight. Behind the building, a line of trees stood like a wall. It looked like a place that had been locked out of its own purpose. I asked about the church at the general store the next morning. The clerk said it had been closed after something happened that people did not agree on. Some said a fire, some said a collapse, some said nothing at all. He asked if I had slept well. I said well enough. He handed me a paper sack with a jar of coffee and a roll of twine inside. I told him I had not asked for these. He said, better to have them. Dunsmuir had its stories, and they traveled like moths that lived in a coat. You shook the sleeve, and one would drift out and flutter near your ear. A driver had left a car running on the bridge with the door open. A pair of hikers had gone into the woods and had returned walking 20 paces apart, each staring straight ahead, each refusing to say a word. A trooper had come to answer a call and never arrived at the address. The trooper's car had been found on the bridge, with the radio still crackling, and a hat had rested on the trunk with a dark ring of water around it, like the hat had been placed on ice. The records, so people said, named the call as a noise complaint. The record did not name the caller. There was a sign in the motel office that said, quiet hours after 11. Another sign sat behind the first sign, half turned away. No mirrors uncovered after midnight. I asked the clerk what that meant. He said some things like to be looked at, some things like to be seen, do not give them what they want. He slid the sign flat on the counter and then slid it back again like it burned. I met a traveler at the gas station just before noon. He wore a jacket too light for October. He had the charged look of someone who had not slept. He said he was a photographer. He said he had set up a tripod across from the chain church the night before. He had waited until 3 in the morning when the bell was supposed to toll, and he had clicked a long exposure. He developed the file in his camera and saw the pews filled with shapes that were not there to the eye. He described shoulders and heads and a black edge like a coat collar around each one. In the last frame, the doorway had held a figure that faced the lens and stood much closer than the lens had been. He had left the camera standing in the grass. He was buying gas with cash and leaving. He would drive until the sun was gone and then keep driving. In the early afternoon, I walked the street that ran behind the diner. It led to Willow Creek Road, where the houses were set back and old. Some windows were nailed over with boards so sun-bleached that they looked like bone. In one yard, a swing hung without a seat. In another yard, I saw a stack of stones and a careful little tower. The air changed on that road. It felt still at first, then it felt full, as if it had a texture that pressed against the skin. I heard a sound like a bell far away, and then I realized it was water moving through culverts, making a hollow metallic tone where it hit the rust. I kept walking until I reached a house that leaned hard to one side. The front steps had sunk, so the door looked surprised. When I pushed the door with my foot, it opened an inch and then stuck against something soft on the other side. A blanket had fallen there, heavy with dust. Inside the room, the walls were covered with old wallpaper, roses. The roses had faded into yellow ghosts that climbed halfway to the ceiling and stopped. On the table in the kitchen sat plates arranged for dinner. There were spoons by each plate and a jar of something dark that had dried into a ring. There was a chair tilted back, as if someone had stood up fast and never sat down again. A floorboard groaned somewhere in the back of the house. My skin tightened. I told myself that it was the heat or the settling of wood. I told myself I had fed the house a draft with the open door. I told myself many things that would allow my feet to move again. I turned and left and walked back toward the road with my hands closed without thinking. When I reached the sunlight, my fingers opened, and I saw that I had been holding little flakes of paint that had stuck to my skin. They were the color of dried roses. In my pocket, I found a loop of twine I did not remember putting there. A woman in the feed store saw me stare at the twine and said that people in Dunsmuir had habits that might appear strange. Keep salt by the door, lay twine in loops on the sill, hang a wind chime without a clapper, leave a coin on the top step. She said these were not for good luck. She said these were for balance. Then she stopped speaking, like someone had pulled a curtain. By late afternoon, fog rose from the creek and stayed stitched to the lowest streets. It did not move the way fog normally moves. It held its line along the curb like a dog. When a truck rolled through it, the fog opened like a mouth and then closed again. People went indoors without rushing and shut their curtains with slow, careful movements. The streetlights snapped on. All of them glowed the same warm color, except one beside Willow Creek Road that gave a colder light that made every leaf look wet. A dog stood under that light and did not cross the line into the street. It lifted its paw and then set it down again on the same square of sidewalk and then looked up like it was listening to something that spoke from inside the bulb. At 7, a group of men gathered near the bridge. Each held a paper bag and a lantern with a chimney so clean that the glass almost vanished. They walked down to the water and set the bags on the bank. The bags lay there like offerings for a river that did not want them. One man cut his bag open and poured salt into the current. Another man tied a loop of twine around a small flat rock and dropped it in. The lanterns brightened and then dimmed so muscle-soft that the light seemed to sigh. No one spoke. The men left in a line spaced evenly, as if they were clock hands leaving marks on air. That night, the motel felt crowded with things that were not in the register. Footsteps stopped outside my door and then moved on. A television clicked on in the room next to mine, even though no car was parked in front of that door. I watched the strip of light under the threshold until it thinned. At 2:57, the bell started. It took a breath and then pushed iron into the night. My chest shook with each tone. The room seemed to lean toward the sound. I counted 1, 2, 3. I stood up without wanting to. 4, 5, 6, 7. I opened the curtain a finger and looked toward the church. The field between the motel and the church held a low moving shape like water. The chain across the doors had gone slack and lay on the steps like a snake resting in the cool. The bell finished its 7th tone, and then the night held its breath. I closed the curtain and put both hands on the fabric because that felt like a thing I could control. The television in the next room clicked off. Something walked down the hallway, and the light under my door dimmed as if a shadow had bent over it. Morning felt false. The sun came up and burned the fog off the tight streets. The field near the church held circles of flattened grass, each as big as a door. At the diner, everyone looked fresher, and no one mentioned the night. Plates clinked, coffee steamed, the bell over the door clinked at the right times, the clock ticked without stalling. The waitress said that the weather would turn colder by dusk. She said I should take a scarf if I planned to walk to the overlook. Then she slid a folded paper across the counter. On the paper was a hand-drawn map. Do not go past the second switchback. Do not leave the path when you hear water on your left. If you smell iron, turn around. The overlook sat above the river. You could see the way the town folded into itself. Roofs pressed shoulder to shoulder, alleys cut sharp between buildings like seams. The church roof stood like a pale island among darker shingles. Beyond the last house, the woods thickened into a dark line. There were clearings that looked circular from up high, rings where the ground had been scraped clean. The air carried the sound of a truck downshifting on the highway far away, and that sound felt like a gift from a world that worked by simple rules. A notebook turned up at the general store that afternoon. It had been left in a crate beside a stack of canned soup. The clerk said it had belonged to a reporter who had stayed in town for 3 nights. The notebook held interviews that started clear and then turned more sparse, like the person holding the pen had gotten tired, or the people speaking had stepped a little farther away with each page. In the margin of one page, a sentence had been written in a different hand. Speak about it, and it speaks back. On the last page, there was a line written and overwritten until the paper nearly tore. They keep the doors chained to keep the voices in. The clerk said the notebook did not belong to me. He said I could look for 1 hour. He set a kitchen timer beside it. He did not look at the pages even once. When the timer rang, he closed the notebook with both palms and slid it under the counter like a cake coming out of a hot oven. The deputy, who served a nearby district, stopped by the diner before dusk. He had careful eyes and a jaw that held a steady line, the look of someone who had tested courage against landscape and learned to move with it. He sat at the counter and stirred his coffee until the spoon touched the china in a slow, even rhythm. He said the bridge played games with radios. He said chargers failed near the church. He said he could tell you how to get around a truck on a blind curve, but he could not tell you what to do if the bell rang and you were in the open. He paid with a bill worn thin from another pocket and left without finishing his coffee. On my second night, I did the thing I had already promised myself I would not do. I walked to the church after dark. The town had settled into its hush, and the air had that tightness again. The grass in the field held my feet in a soft grip, and the dew reached my ankles. The chain across the doors was taut tonight and silent. I could smell stone. The kind of smell you get from a wet basement when you first open the door. I touched the chain with one finger and felt a faint vibration. It pulsed like the beat of a thing sleeping inside. Around the doorframe, tiny nails had been tapped in at an even distance, the heads marked with chalk. There was a scrap of ribbon hanging from one nail. It had letters printed on it that had faded until only a pattern remained. I stood with my ear near the wood and heard a sound that I have no perfect words for. A voice, yet not one. Breathing, yet not lungs. It was a presence you could hear with your teeth. I stepped back, and the sound stepped back at the same distance. The grass behind me made a hush as something turned in it and then went still. I do not think the people of Dunsmuir hate the church. I think they fear what uses the church as a mouth. They live with it the way a family lives with a sickness that is older than any memory. It does not improve or get worse. It simply holds its ground. You learn the shape of days around it. You find a rhythm that lets you eat and sleep and keep your children inside on the nights that matter. The town had a cemetery on high ground behind the school. The path to it ran beside a stone wall that had seen more hands than any railing. The stones in the cemetery were close together. Many of them were old and unreadable, their faces worn smooth. A few were newer and plain. The newer ones did not list a date of death. They listed a month of birth and then a dash that had been carved and polished and left empty. A dish of white pebbles sat on one of those stones. The pebbles were stacked in a shape like a small tower. At the base of another stone, someone had left a bag of salt tied, shut with twine. From the hill, you could see the whole town, each roof a note on a page. The wind pushed the grass so it laid down and stood up again. The bell did not ring in the day. The bell waited for its hour. I want to tell you exactly what happened on the third night, and I will, but I also want to say that I did not go looking for permission from anyone after it was over. I did not ask the town if I could tell it. No one would have answered. Silence has a way of taking ownership that speech cannot break. So I will set down what I saw and heard, and you can decide what it means for you. I sat in the motel room with the lamp off and the curtains pulled tight. I had placed a line of salt along the door and window ledges in a neat, clean stripe. The television was unplugged. The card with the rules lay face up under the lamp. At 2:50, the air in the room cooled, and my breath came out in a small cloud that faded and returned and faded again. The hallway went quiet, even more quiet than before. 3 minutes crawled by on the clock. Then the first strike of the bell rolled through the walls. 1. The chain of the church slid with weight on wood. 2. A footstep on gravel, soft but different from shoes, the sound you hear when a bare heel presses a stone. 3. A voice outside my door that spoke nothing I understood, not words, but intention. 4. A second voice, speaking the first sentence I had heard spoken by a stranger in this town after dark. Do not answer. The voice sounded like the waitress, or perhaps anyone who had learned that voice is sometimes a rope and sometimes a door. 5. The television clicked on even though it had no power. The screen stayed black, but it had a hum, and patterns moved inside that blackness like fish far below the surface of a lake. I looked at the card and remembered the simple line. If the television turns on by itself, do not look at the screen. I turned my head away and kept my eyes on the zipper of the suitcase on the chair. 6. The space under the door brightened with a light that carried dust in it, dust that moved like breath. The light pressed against the salt in a slow tide and then eased back, like a hand feeling along a locked window. 7. The bell lifted its last tone into the rafters of the night, and the motel creaked like a tree that has survived another strong wind. Silence is not always a lack. Sometimes it fills space and holds shape. After the last tone, the silence felt made, as if it had been built in a shop and fitted into place. The light under the door went away. The hum in the television dimmed and stopped. A single footstep moved away down the hall, then another, each landing at a measured distance, the way a person would walk if they had been asked not to wake a sleeper. I stood very still and waited for the air to warm. It did not. I waited for the urge to open the curtain to pass. It did not. I opened it anyway. The field that afternoon had held circles of flattened grass. Now it held people, or the shape of people, gathered in rows that faced the church. They were not solid. They were arranged like a choir. The chain on the door lay slack again, and the left door hung open to a black the eyes refused to name. The shapes in the field swayed a little and then grew still. I realized that I could not hear crickets. I could not hear anything at all. The quiet felt like a pressure in the ears. Then the shapes lifted their heads, and the air carried the sound of breath, one breath made of many. The breath moved toward the church, and from the dark inside the church came another breath moving out like two oceans pressing against each other at a meeting point. The grass bent in a ripple. My chest tightened as if tied. I slid the curtain closed and stood with my hands on it and whispered that simple plea that anyone might whisper anywhere when the night raises a hand. Please be over. Please let the morning come. Dawn finally came, soft and ordinary. The motel parking lot held wet marks where feet had stood, but they were not footprints. They were circles, each the size of a plate, each a little darker than the concrete around it. The chain on the church hung in a clean line again, and the lock looked dry and new. The diner had fresh pastries on the counter and a smell like nutmeg in the air. The waitress poured coffee and asked if I would be leaving that day. Her voice sounded relieved and tired at the same time. I told her I wanted to understand. She looked at the clock and then back at me. She said that once there had been a mill in the hollow near the church, the creek had shifted and flooded it, and the water stood for a season in dark rooms. Men went in to pull out the machinery. A bell that had hung in the mill and had not been used in years fell and cracked, and the piece that broke off rang once on stone and then rolled into water. After that, the nights became heavy. People woke and found handprints on the inside of windows sitting 10 feet from the floor. Children said they heard singing where no one stood. Many tried to leave. Tires turned to rags just past the bridge. The air in the car turned to glass and made the lungs hurt. A woman drove in circles and ended up back at the feed store with tears on her face and mud up to the door handles. The town stayed. They learned the times. They learned the rituals. They told their children how to live with a thing that pressed without ceasing. Then she wiped a cup with a cloth that had not been in her hand a moment before. She said, "Do not ask more. I like you. I do not want to see your car on the bridge with the door open and the radio talking to itself." I left a little after noon. The highway pulled me like a magnet pulls a nail. The bridge sang its hollow metal song and then went quiet. The river moved under the trees. The road climbed out of the hollow, and the sky opened, and the air felt simple again. I passed a truck that shook its load, and a trooper car set back on a gravel lot, watching traffic, and the sight of that car felt like a promise that rules still worked somewhere. At a gas station 2 towns away, I washed my hands twice and still smelled stone. I bought coffee and drank it so hot it shook my throat, and the burn felt like proof that something could be measured by a simple scale again. A week later, a small padded envelope arrived at my home. It had no return address. Inside was a motel key with a plastic tag that bore a number. There was a folded photograph of the motel parking lot in the gray before sunrise. In the foreground, a window glowed. The curtain hung open half a hand. In the glass, you could see a reflection of the lot and the field and the shadow of a person standing with a camera lifted to their face. The camera was mine. The person was me. Behind that reflection, there was a second reflection that did not belong. It was the pallid shape of the church door held a sliver open, and the clean, bright edge of the lock held between two fingers, and you could see the curve of nails like tiny moons. On the back of the photo was a single line in ink. Leave twine on the sill and do not speak of what you know. That line sits on my desk as I tell you this. I run my thumb over it and the ink feels raised like a scar. I want to tell you that I drove back to Dunsmuir and demanded answers. I did not. I want to tell you that I called the deputy and handed over the photo. I did not. What would any law do with a shadow? What would any law say to a bell that rings without a hand? The world has rules that we can see and touch. Then the world has rules that grow like roots, threading under the road and the house and the floor and the bed. You can pretend they are not there. You can build above them. But if a town learns those rules first, and if that town decides the price of survival is silence, then that town will become a place where breakfast is served hot, and the coffee is strong, and the eyes of the waitress are always a little flat at the edges. Months went by. At night, a few times, I woke to the memory of that iron tone and thought I heard it in the pipes. I kept a coil of twine in the kitchen drawer. I am not a person who believes in charms, yet I tied a loop around the curtain cord and left it there. Once I found a little drift of salt piled near the door when I had not spilled any. I swept it up and then poured fresh salt along the threshold and told myself it was only because winter was coming. There is a rule that travels with this story. It is not mine, it belongs to the town. Do not invite it by speaking to it with the wrong respect. Speak about the town with a pause and a steady breath. Speak about the people with care and with a kind of love, because they are living under a weight that does not lift. If you find yourself on that highway on a gray day in late October, and if you see the old sign with the letters trying to fall away, and if curiosity pulls your hands to the left, think about the chain on the church and the salt on the sills and the bell that does not need a hand to move. Think about the way a quiet rule can hold a place together better than any law. You can keep the river on your right and keep moving. You can tell yourself that the world in front of you is enough. If you ignore that voice and drive down into the hollow, if you drink the coffee and feel the counter vibrate under your fingers when no truck is passing, if you take a room with a blanket that weighs more than it should, then remember the rules you did not ask for. Curtains closed. No music after midnight. If you hear the bell at 3, stay inside. If the television hums without a picture, turn your face away and count to 7 slowly, and then wait for the air to warm. If you walk by the church and your finger finds the chain and feels it breathe, take your hand back and hold it against your own chest until your own breath pushes the rhythm away. In the morning, you can leave. The bridge will carry you like a person carries a sleeping child, with a weight that feels heavier than it should and a care that feels older than time. I do not know what sleeps behind that door. I do not know what the town traded or promised. I know only that the people keep their lives by staying quiet and moving with the rhythm of the thing that lives inside their nights. They will smile at you without warmth. They will tell you how to find the next town without looking you in the eye. They will slide a key across a counter and keep their hand on it for a breath. They will slip you a coil of twine and a jar of salt and not say why. They will not talk about it. They will not say its name. They will live with it and let it live with them, and the bell will ring when it wants to ring, and dawn will come, and bread will rise in ovens, and school buses will climb the hill, and wind will scuff the tops of corn, and the river will turn and turn like a key in an old lock. So, if you ever find yourself near a town that holds the air too tight, and if silence greets you at the door before the bell above it clinks, and if you feel a presence slip into the room like a draft that knows your name, remember this. Some places survive by speaking. This place survives by not speaking at all. And if you stay long enough, you may understand the rule deep in your bones. By then, it will be too late to forget it. By then, you will carry it with you like a small, smooth stone in your pocket, always there, always pressing against your hand when you reach for your keys at night. She answered the wrong call and disappeared. She answered the wrong call one quiet evening in late autumn when the sky above the small town was a dull slate gray and the streets had emptied out hours earlier. The air had turned cold enough that even the occasional car passing through left a trail of mist from its exhaust. Inside her modest single-story house at the edge of town, the lights were dim, a single lamp glowing in the living room, throwing a pale yellow halo across the worn rug. It was nearly 9:30 when the phone buzzed on the coffee table. She'd been curled up on the couch, with a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, sipping lukewarm tea, fighting back the creeping stillness of the night. The number on the screen wasn't familiar. There was no name, no area code she recognized, only a sequence that didn't make sense. She almost ignored it, but something in her gut pushed her to answer. The moment she picked up, the line was filled with static. Not the usual background fuzz of a bad connection, but deep, layered static, like voices whispering from beneath the surface. She said hello twice, her voice shaking, and just as she was about to hang up, she heard her own name spoken. It wasn't loud, it wasn't slurred, it was whispered with chilling precision, as though the caller was right behind her, leaning in close enough to breathe against her ear. Her throat tightened. She asked who it was, but instead of an answer, the voice began murmuring in a language she couldn't place. The tone was guttural, uneven, broken by pauses that felt deliberate, like someone reciting something they weren't meant to. Then the sound cut, and the line went dead. She stared at the phone in her hand, her reflection warped in the dark screen. It had to be a prank. Some teenager with a voice filter or a wrong number crafted into something unnerving. She tried to laugh at herself for feeling rattled, but when she rose to check the doors, she found the back one slightly ajar. Just an inch, enough to let a draft creep inside. She distinctly remembered locking it earlier. She shut it firmly, bolted it, and told herself not to panic. Yet her body betrayed her. Her palms were sweaty, her heartbeat rapid, echoing in her ears, louder than the ticking clock on the wall. Half an hour later, the phone lit up again. This time, the number looked stranger. Only 5 digits, nothing resembling a proper call ID. She froze, staring at it, hoping it would stop. But it rang, insistent, and without realizing it, she swiped to answer. The same voice returned, clearer now. It whispered her street name, then her house number. Each word dragged across her nerves like a blade. She wanted to hang up, but the voice grew closer, louder, until the hissing static transformed into what felt like breath. She slammed her thumb down and ended the call, tossing the phone onto the couch. The silence that followed was worse. Every tick of the clock was amplified. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounded like a roar. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, lungs working overtime. She tried calling her closest friend, but the call wouldn't connect. No signal, no bars, though her phone had worked fine earlier. She tried to distract herself with the television, flipping through channels, but nothing stuck. Her hands trembled around the remote. Then another notification appeared. A voicemail. Her phone hadn't even rung. With dread pressing down on her, she played it. The message was simple. A slow creak, unmistakable, of her back door opening. Her blood ran cold. She rushed into the kitchen, flashlight clutched in one hand, wrench in the other, heart beating so hard she thought it would give out. The door was closed, locked. The chain was still latched, but the floor below showed faint moisture, small patches of wetness, as though something cold had pressed against it. She backed away. She wanted to run outside, but she convinced herself again that it had to be a trick, some sick recording, maybe someone watching her from a distance. She moved room to room, shutting curtains, switching on lights, anything to drive the shadows out. At 10:47, another voicemail appeared. This one froze her in place. It was her own voice, distorted but undeniably hers, crying out, "Help me!" followed by dragging noises and silence. Her knees nearly buckled. She couldn't understand how it was possible. She checked the windows again, but each curtain concealed only the reflection of her terrified face. Then came a tapping. At first faint, then deliberate. Fingernails against glass. One tap, then another, then another. She turned with the flashlight, aiming it toward the back of the living room window. Nothing. Just condensation streaking down from the cold night. Unable to stay inside, she grabbed her keys and bolted for the front door. The night outside was suffocatingly quiet. No crickets, no dogs barking, no distant traffic. Just a silence so thick it felt alive. She got into her car, locked the doors, shoved the key into the ignition. The engine refused to start. She tried again and again until finally the car roared awake. Relief lasted only seconds. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. The same strange number. She ignored it, gripping the wheel, speeding out onto the deserted road. The phone continued ringing, vibrating against the leather seat. Against every ounce of will, she glanced at the screen. This time, the call wasn't from the strange number. It displayed her own name as the caller ID. Her heart lurched. She swerved slightly, fumbling for control. The road a blur beneath her headlights. The ringing stopped. Then another voicemail appeared. She pressed play with trembling hands, and what she heard nearly made her lose control of the car. It was the sound of her own vehicle's engine, humming exactly as it was at that moment. Over it, faint and shaky, was her own voice gasping for air. Not a recording from earlier, it was happening as she listened. She slammed the brakes, pulling to the shoulder, clutching the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. She shut the phone off completely, shoved it into the glove box, and sat in darkness. The world around her felt heavier, as though the night itself had folded in. That was the last time anyone saw her. 2 days later, her car was found abandoned on a remote stretch of highway bordering the woods. The driver's door hung open, the keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat lay her phone, battery dead, screen black. Investigators powered it on. Dozens of unheard voicemails filled the inbox. Most were blank, filled only with faint breathing. But the last one was different. It carried a voice, low and final, whispering, "You shouldn't have answered." Police scoured the area, dogs were brought in, but the trail vanished at the tree line as though she had stepped into the woods and simply disappeared. There were no footprints beyond the ditch, no sign of struggle. Her disappearance spread quickly through the town, whispered about in diners and gas stations. Some dismissed it as an abduction, a planned escape, or foul play from someone she knew. But others believed the calls weren't human at all. Neighbors recalled the night she vanished. One swore they heard a woman screaming faintly from the woods around 11, though the sound cut off too suddenly as though swallowed by the trees. Another claimed to have seen a tall shadow near her driveway earlier that evening, a shape that didn't match any person they knew. The phone records were stranger still. Investigators traced the calls, but none of them had a proper origin. The numbers were malformed, non-existent. The voicemails showed timestamps, but no originating tower. A technician who reviewed them late at night reportedly refused to continue after listening. He never told anyone what he heard, only saying it was wrong, that the recordings didn't sound like anything a phone should be able to capture. Her family clung to the hope she might return, that she had fled to escape someone or something. But weeks turned into months, and no trace of her was ever found. The case went cold. The phone, locked away in an evidence box, still carried the corrupted voicemails. To this day, officers who handled it claim the device would sometimes power on by itself, showing missed calls at random hours, always from the same incomplete number. People in the town avoid answering late-night calls from unknown numbers. A kind of folklore grew around it. They say if your phone rings past midnight and the ID is incomplete, you must never answer. Because if you do, the voice on the other end won't be a stranger. It will be your own, whispering from somewhere you can't reach, pulling you closer until you disappear, just like she did that night. And now, whenever the phone rings in that quiet town after dark, even the bravest admit their hearts skip a beat, because everyone remembers the woman who answered the wrong call and was never seen again. Why this tape was locked away for decades is, it began with a quiet knock on a metal door just after midnight, the kind of soft, embarrassed tapping that makes a night shift officer glance up and wonder if they imagined it. The archives room at the Mill County Sheriff's Office sat at the end of a dim corridor where the vending machines hummed and the fluorescent lights buzzed like tired cicadas. Deputy Mark Doyle had the key. He'd been told to keep the door closed unless someone from records was with him, but that night, a dispatcher slid him a note that said, a homeowner on Buckhorn Road had found an old VHS tape in a box of junk taken from an estate sale. The homeowner said there were voices on it. He said the tape knew his name. Before we begin, tell me where are you listening from and what time is it there? Doyle wasn't the superstitious type. He took the cardboard shoebox from the man who waited on the bench outside the bullpen, a guy who kept wringing his baseball cap and glancing toward the empty hallway like something might step into view at any second. The address on the receipt tucked in the box matched the old Hanley property out by Pine Hollow, a farmhouse everyone in the county knew for one reason or another. Teenagers dared each other to shine headlights at its hollow windows at night. Hunters used the overgrown pasture as a landmark. Years ago, a missing person search had used that house as a staging area for one long, cold week. Snow fell, search dogs whined. Nothing was resolved. Doyle carried the box into archives, flipped the light, and breathed in that dry, papery air that always smelled like stapled reports and lost time. Steel shelves marched in rows. A portable television on a wheeled cart sat in a corner beside a VCR the department kept for old evidence. He could have logged the tape and gone home. He could have sealed it, labeled it, done everything exactly by the book. Instead, the quiet got to him. The knowledge that he could dismiss a frightened man's worry with a simple, ordinary glance at ordinary static tempted him like a dare whispered in a crowded bar. He lifted the tape from the box. The plastic felt heavier than it should have, cool as if it had come from a refrigerator. Along the edge, someone had written in block letters with a thick marker, "Do not watch." Doyle smiled despite himself, that crooked grin people wear when they plan to disobey a childlike warning. He slid the cassette into the VCR, turned on the TV, and waited for snow to fill the screen, for dead air to hiss, for nothing to happen so he could shrug and clock out. The picture rolled once, twice, then steadied. A murky grayscale image formed, bleary at first, then startlingly clear. The frame showed a living room with a low ceiling and narrow windows. Lace curtains, a braided rug, a cabinet with a radio the size of a suitcase, a calendar tacked to the wall by the kitchen door, the page flipped to a month. Doyle couldn't make out because of glare from a lamp. It looked like the past, not just in the decor, but in the way the air itself seemed thick, as if the room were underwater. The timestamp in the corner was broken into nonsense, the digits dissolving and reforming like frost. No one spoke. No one walked through the frame. For a long minute, the camera just looked. Doyle leaned closer. The lens seemed to be placed at chest height near a doorway, angled slightly down, not on a tripod exactly, but on something stable. The room felt intact, clean, lived in, not abandoned. Then a sound rose, faint as breath on glass. It was not words, not yet, more like a murmur between floorboards. Doyle frowned and reached for the volume knob with a slow hand, as if a loud movement might startle whatever he was hearing. When the voices resolved, they didn't feel like actors captured on tape. They felt like people very near the microphone, speaking in low, urgent tones to a child. A man said, "Hush." A woman said, "Look at me." The child replied with a small, broken no, not like defiance, but like a plea. The camera did not turn. It stared at the empty room, and somewhere just out of frame, someone began to cry quietly. Not the chest-shaking sobs of panic, but the restrained, frightened weeping of someone trying not to be heard. Doyle's mouth went dry. He checked the box for a note, for a label, for anything that might explain what the homeowner had really brought him. He found nothing but a receipt with the estate sale address and a second piece of paper folded twice that smelled faintly, unbelievably, like storm-damp earth. On that paper, written in a narrower hand, were 4 words. "If you value sleep." The picture fluttered, The camera wasn't moving, but something in the light shifted like the room had inhaled. Doyle touched the screen with his fingertips and felt static buzz against his skin. The lens appeared to change focus without any mechanical sound, as if it were choosing where to look. At the edge of the braided rug, a small shadow lengthened, the sort of soft, feathered shape you'd expect from a lamp. Only the lamp's shadow should have leaned away from the lamp. This one drew toward it, like something beyond the frame was changing the angle of light in a way that made no physical sense. Doyle murmured an involuntary, "Hey," and stepped back. Another voice came from off-camera, older, brittle, words like dried leaves. "You can't make it let go," it said. "Not now, not after this long." The child's small voice said something that the microphone didn't catch, and the older voice replied, "It will learn you. It always learns you." On instinct, Doyle reached for the remote. He wanted to stop it, not because of what he saw, but because of what his body felt, a faint vibration in the floor that could have been his own pulse until he realized it was syncing with the soft thump coming from the television. He hit pause. The image froze on a mid-tone gray frame. The thump continued, steady, spaced like footsteps on stairs. He ejected the tape with a shaky forefinger and pinched the cassette between the pads of his fingers as if it might sting him. He wrote an evidence label in block letters, sealed the tape in a bag, and carried it to a shelf at the very back where old burglary photos and mold-smelling diaries sat without attention. He locked the cage and told himself he'd call records in the morning, he'd call the homeowner, he'd pass this on like any other odd but harmless item. Then he turned off the lights and stood in the doorway longer than he meant to, listening with a sort of childish dread for the sound of the television clicking on by itself. It stayed dark. He laughed under his breath, a thin, embarrassed sound, and went home in the gray hour before dawn. He did not sleep. The tape might have gathered dust there if not for a flood in the basement 2 weeks later that forced the department to move stacks of files into the hallway. While shifting boxes, an archivist with a neat desk and a quiet manner named Lena Cotton saw the words on the label and felt a ripple of something she couldn't name. She had grown up near Pine Hollow. She remembered the search parties that trudged through the fields with fluorescent vests and hand warmers tucked in their gloves. She also remembered, more faintly, that her grandmother used to stop speaking when the Hanley property was mentioned, as if the house itself could overhear you. Lena did not believe in curses. She believed in chain of custody forms, in signatures that didn't smudge, in lists that balanced. Yet that night, with the basement pump whining and the fluorescent lights flickering just enough to look like blinking eyes, she rolled the VCR cart into a conference room and shut the door. She told herself she was previewing the tape so she could write an accurate synopsis for the catalog. She told herself she was saving time, saving money, saving the department another headache. She set the tape in the machine, sat on a folding chair with the back pressed to the wall, and let the screen fill a square of the dark with a light that never felt warm. This time, the picture began in the hallway of a house, the camera aimed at a narrow staircase. The steps were steep, the banister worn smooth at the places where hands had polished it through habit. The carpet runner had a faded floral pattern. Lena recognized a pattern like that from her grandmother's place, the kind of rug older relatives never threw away, no matter how frayed it became at the edges. The audio was clearer now. You could hear a radio murmuring something distant, not words, but the rise and fall of a human voice. Then the footsteps started again, that soft, measured thump. They were not coming down the stairs. They were ascending, slow, patient, pausing on every third step, like whoever was climbing had to listen before they took the next one. Lena felt it then. The slightest tremor against the soles of her shoes, as if the building itself were acknowledging the sound. She paused the tape, pushed the chair back, and stood up too quickly. The room swam. When she hit play again, the camera angle had shifted. It now looked into a small bedroom at the top of the stairs. A bedspread with a quilted ring pattern covered the mattress. A glass of water sat on a nightstand beside a neatly stacked paperback and a cloth-bound journal with an elastic band. She saw a hand near the glass, not reaching for it, but resting beside it. For a terrible second, she thought the hand was severed, alone on the table. Then she recognized the slow flex of fingers at rest. Someone sat on the edge of the bed, just out of frame. The voice of the older person returned. That brittle whisper. "Don't face it," they said. "You feed it every time you do." The child said, "What if it says my name?" The older voice waited a heartbeat, then said, "It will. It always does." You say this instead, and the sentence that followed was swallowed by a burst of static that sounded like a storm sucked through a straw. Lena's phone buzzed on the table, a small mechanical rattle that felt obscene in that room of slow dread. She let it go to voicemail, not because she wanted to keep watching, but because she felt if she cut the thread the tape had thrown into the room, something else would tug the loose end through. The camera did not move, yet the focus looked past the bedroom door into the hallway, as if the lens had decided the important thing was not the bed or the hand, but the dark mouth of the stairwell where the air looked thicker than air should. The screen cut out. The time counter on the VCR rolled forward soundlessly for several more seconds. Then an entirely new scene appeared, one that made Lena make a noise she had not made since she was a child alone in the upstairs bathroom at night. The new frame showed a different living room, one with drop ceiling tiles and a cheap shelf of binders and a corkboard with pinned memos. It took her a heartbeat to recognize that it was the very conference room she was sitting in, the camera positioned exactly where the television was now. The angle caught the folding chairs, the coffee stain near the wall, and the metal door with the scratch across it shaped like a crooked smile. The television in the frame was dark, but its screen held a smear of light in which a person could be seen faintly, as if reflected in a rain-blurred window. Lena did not want to lean closer, but she did. The person in the reflection was seated at a table. Their posture was unmistakably her own. A hand came up in the reflection and touched the side of the face. Her fingertips on her own cheek felt cool. Then the door in the granular image opened a fraction, and a shadow crossed the threshold in a way that made her stomach drop because it did not move like a person. It moved like a tilt in the frame, as if the picture had been lifted and whatever was outside had slid toward the low edge. The screen went black, the VCR clicked, and the tape stopped. Lena found that her throat hurt. She realized she had been holding her breath long enough to make her lungs ache. She waited for the childish instinct to pass, the one that told her to lift her feet onto the chair like something might be patient and low to the ground. Instead, she stood up, pulled the tape free, sealed it, labeled it again for good measure, and carried it to the furthest edge of the evidence room where she placed it, without ceremony, behind a ledger of vehicle thefts no one consulted anymore. On the outside of the cassette box, she added one more line beneath "Do Not Watch." She wrote, "Return to Hanley box." The next small thing that shouldn't have mattered but did was a maintenance call from the property owner who'd purchased the Hanley land when the farmhouse was finally condemned and knocked down. He wanted to build a storage garage and complained the foundation behaved like a sponge. Workers poured gravel and watched it settle overnight, as if the ground had exhaled. On the second morning, one of the crew placed his thermos on a stack of lumber, stepped away, and when he returned, the thermos lay on its side with a neat wet circle beneath it, water inching toward the old footprint of the staircase. He swore he heard a radio far away, a voice he couldn't make out, speaking steadily like someone reading a forecast to a room that had no window. Word spread the way it does in small places where everybody knows everybody, not through official channels, but through murmured confessions at the end of shifts. A dispatcher named Brooks admitted he heard his own name whispered from the archives cage when he passed it on a night he knew no one was inside. A EMT said the television in the break room flickered to a local news channel that hadn't existed in years and ran a crawl with his street spelled wrong. A substitute teacher told a friend she saw a shape in the reflection of the gym office door during a lockdown drill. Not a person exactly, but a bend in the light that felt like looking down old stairs. A journalist living 2 towns over, Mallory Keene, heard the rumors when she stopped for coffee, and a man in a dusty jacket told her, with a seriousness that made her set down her cup, that there was a tape at the sheriff's office that kept finding new rooms to show. She did not laugh. She was the sort who never laughed when someone told a story that made them scared. She filed a records request for anything relating to the Hanley property, to Buckhorn Road, to a VHS cassette turned in by a resident whose name she'd been given on a napkin stained with cream. The department responded with a polite denial that said no such item could be located. She filed again, narrower, and received a similar answer that used slightly different phrasing, as if an actual person had decided to make the refusal sound less like a form. Mallory did not give up. She visited the Hanley lot on a cloudy afternoon when the air smelled like rain and distant train brakes. The pad of the old foundation lay like a dull gray tooth against the weeds. A few stacked pallets leaned against a roll-up door on a new storage unit the owner was adding. She walked the perimeter slowly, counting her steps, listening. When she reached the place where a broken corner of concrete dipped into loam, her phone vibrated with a call from a number she didn't know. She answered without speaking first. A woman's voice said hello in that breathless, considerate tone people use when they are in a library or a church. Then the voice said, "Don't face it," and the connection filled with a rushing that did not sound like interference so much as wind in a narrow stairwell. Mallory said, "Who is this?" And the line went dead. Her call log recorded the number, but when she dialed it back, 3 hollow beeps told her it did not exist. She wrote the story anyway. She wrote it as a feature about the persistence of place, about the way a town layers its fears like paint over old wallpaper. She did not name the tape because she could not prove it. She did not accuse the department because she had no interest in being uninvited to the meetings where people say the things that matter when the recorder is off. She printed it in the Sunday edition with a photograph of her own hand closing around a fragment of blue and white ceramic she found near a place the old kitchen would have been, a piece of a plate, a vague pattern of flowers that had outlived the table where someone once set it down after drying the dish with a towel that smelled of sunshine. That would have been the end, a story people folded into their morning and forgot by lunch, if not for a thing that followed. 2 days after the story ran, a padded envelope arrived at the paper addressed to Mallory. Inside was a tape, no label, no return address, only a note on notebook paper torn from the center of a spiral. It read, "Not the same one, but you'll see." Her stomach let go a little. She set the tape on her desk, watched the sun strike its plastic edge, and told herself it was a prank as her skin tried to make her stand up and leave the building without her bag. She borrowed a VCR from the library, set it up in the paper's small conference room, and pressed play. The screen opened on a frame so ordinary that for half a minute her chest loosened with relief. It was a living room in a rental house, beige carpet, white walls, television against a wall, sofa with the kind of cushions that always look one day too old. Her reporter's brain started to inventory details she could track. A magnet from a diner in Cleveland on the fridge in a doorless kitchen, a floppy-eared dog bed with no dog in it, a blue rain jacket slung over a chair. Then she stopped taking notes because the camera angle was wrong in a way that made her palms sweat. The view came from a place slightly above the television, but too close to be an obvious shelf. It had that same chest-height perspective as the other tape, and there was no warble in the image a handheld camera would produce. The audio at first was nothing, and then faint, as if sound were arriving down a long hallway. A clock ticked. A floorboard gave a single, complaining groan as wood settled. Then, very softly, someone in another room said hello with that same considerate hush she had heard on the phone at the Hanley lot. The voice belonged to no one she knew. The word landed not as greeting, but as recognition, like when you answer your name in a roll call. Mallory waited for a person to enter the frame and explain the illusions we give ourselves when we watch an empty room long enough. No one did. Instead, the camera's focus shifted toward the black glass of the turned-off television, where something like a reflection began to show. It was not herself. It was the suggestion of a staircase behind her, wood darker than the floors in this room, rails braided with lamp shadow. The angle was wrong, impossible. It was as if the television were a window into a different place that did not care about the geometry of this address. A whisper came, clearer now. It said her last name, not entirely right, as if it struggled with the consonants. Then it said, "Don't face it." She did not touch the remote. She did not breathe for 2 beats. She did the thing the voice told her not to do. She stood up and stepped closer to the television until her own outline hovered on the glass. Her outline did not match the one in the tape. In the tape, the outline leaned toward the screen from an angle she could not occupy in this room. Her throat closed. She lunged for the stop button and punched it, then yanked the tape out like it might bite. Her fingers shook. She slid the cassette back into the padded envelope with the note and sealed it with a strip of tape like a bandage. She took the envelope to the sheriff's office with a tired half smile and a comment about pranks that get too personal. She did not want to keep that object in her building. Chief Whitaker, a man with kinder eyes than his jawline suggested, opened the envelope, looked at the tape, and said, in a voice that told her he had been waiting longer than she knew, "You should have brought this yesterday." He didn't mean to scold. He meant, "This thing finds its way." He meant, "We don't like bringing new names into its mouth." In a small room with a clock that ticked louder than a clock should, Whitaker, Doyle, Lena, and Mallory watched the tape together for precisely 1 minute and 8 seconds. The chief insisted on a timer. At 68 seconds, no matter what, he would stop it. He would unplug it from the wall if he had to. He said it like someone repeating a rule that is not written down but is followed because people who broke it could not bear to be the example. He pressed play. The room on the screen was the conference room they were sitting in, as if the tape had been made in the past hour. The chair where Mallory sat was empty in the image, as if in that version she had stepped away. The audio carried a sound none of them could mistake for anything else. The shuffle of someone climbing a narrow flight of stairs, the pause every 3 steps, the listening. Doyle put his knuckles on the table and did not move. Lena's lips parted, eyes fixed not on the screen, but on the window glass of the door to the hall, as if she expected to see a shadow pass by the small wired pane at any second. Whitaker's thumb hovered over the stop button from the first second. At 43 seconds, a whisper came. It said Mark, then Lena, then Mallory, then Chief, in a tone that somehow sounded courteous and delighted at once, as if the act of saying their names were a game. They all felt the floor vibrate. Doyle closed his eyes like a person bracing for a familiar pain. At 68 seconds, the chief pressed stop with a flat palm that made the plastic button thwack. The tape rolled a fraction too long. The image shifted in that fraction, and they all saw, for less than a breath, the top landing of stairs none of them recognized, and the corner where a small hand lay on a nightstand, fingers flexing once. Whitaker unplugged the TV and the VCR from the wall and coiled the cords with a concentration that looked like prayer disguised as habit. He put the tape in a plastic case, like a lunch container, and lowered it into a locked drawer that did not look like it had ever held anything as ordinary as office supplies. He told them they would sign a piece of paper that said the envelope had arrived, that they had noted the contents, that the contents were not described beyond cassette. He did not say why the description was vague. He did not have to. Lena understood that to name a thing too precisely felt like an invitation. That night, Mallory sat up in bed at 2:17 a.m., alarm cold in her chest, because she had felt a shift on the mattress at her knees like a cat jumping up. She did not own a cat. She heard the soft, polite hello from the space near her closet, said in a tone that sounded less like a greeting and more like someone pronouncing a word out loud to learn what it felt like in their mouth. She did not turn her head. She moved her fingers very slowly to the lamp switch and turned on the light. The room looked exactly as she left it. The air, however, had that thickness of a stairwell where many feet have passed. She whispered into the lit room, "You can't make it let go," and surprised herself by crying without a noise. Days passed. The county moved on with the practiced amnesia of places that refused to let their worst things define them. A football game. A church bake sale. A rumor that the storage unit company had gone out of business because no one wanted to rent space on land where the ground remembered a table and a radio and a bed that faced a door at the wrong angle. Mallory wrote about other things, budgets and road repairs, and a good kid who taught himself to tune pianos. She also visited a professor of media studies at the university one county over, a man who looked like a nice uncle and kept an oscilloscope on his desk for no reason he could explain that didn't sound like a hobby. His name was Leland Morrow. He listened to her carefully, hands steepled like someone pretending to pray, and then realizing they had continued to hold the pose because it helped them think. Morrow agreed to examine the audio from the tape without watching the video. He said the old VCR had an audio out he could patch into his own equipment. He said it would preserve his objectivity, then laughed because objectivity was a word academics use when they mean, I need a ritual that makes me brave. They borrowed the department's machine and set it up in a lab that smelled like dust and old coffee. The waveform rose on his monitor like a soft mountain range. He found signal where there should have been nothing and silence where signal should live. He found a narrowband tone riding the entire recording, sometimes drifting just above human hearing. He said, tearing his eyes from the screen with evident effort, "This feels like something learning to hum along." He asked if he could see 68 seconds of the footage with the sound muted. Mallory said no and felt something like relief flash through the room as if the walls themselves waited for that answer. Morrow respected the refusal and wrote his notes with ink that seemed to dry too slowly, letters smearing at the edges like they wanted to move. He emailed her later that night with a simple message that consisted of 2 lines. The first line said, "You don't want to be right about this." The second line said, "But I don't think you're wrong." As with all things people don't entirely understand, a second tape eventually appeared, not because anyone sought it, but because this is how such stories sustain their own breath. It arrived not in the mail, but on a shelf in the back of the archive's cage, placed perfectly square on top of a ledger from a year when Lena had not yet been born. She only saw it because she felt a draft move along her ankles, as if someone who had just passed by had brushed the air. She stood absolutely still, afraid that if she moved too quickly, she would step into the place where the draft had been and discover that the absence had more shape than the presence. The second tape looked like the first, unmarked, no label at all. She used a marker to write no on both edges, then put it in a separate case and took it to Whitaker with a composure she did not feel. He did not want to watch it. He also could not imagine not watching it. He chose 68 seconds again. This time, before he pressed play, he said a thing he had never said out loud at work. He said, "If it says your name, you don't say mine in return." He didn't know why that felt like the rule, it just did. The second tape showed the Hanley house as it had been in those earlier sequences, but from a different angle. The camera sat on the landing upstairs, aimed at a door left slightly ajar. The hand on the nightstand returned, fingers flexing once, slow. The tone Morrow had described became a feeling along the gum line in the watchers' mouths, a faint ache like the anticipation of a storm. 30 seconds in, the audio, though muted, seemed to push at the edges of the room like pressure. 40 seconds. 50. Doyle counted in his head and found his counting didn't align with the seconds, as if the tape had its own minute hand. At 62 seconds, the door in the picture swung wider without a hand on the knob. The bed sat empty. The water glass was half full. The journal had shifted a fraction, the elastic band now slanting. A voice that none of them could hear because the sound was muted, nevertheless placed itself in the geometry of the room like a new piece of furniture, and Mallory squeezed her eyes shut because she felt her own name forming behind her teeth unbidden. At 68 seconds, the chief pressed stop with a controlled, almost sorrowing finality. The screen went blue, the VCR whirred, the sound horribly domestic. They decided then, not with a ceremony, but with the muscle memory of people who have survived storms, that the tapes would be locked in a metal cabinet against the far wall, and that an inventory would list them only as 2 cassettes associated with a closed property matter. No one spoke of destroying them, no one raised fire or hammers. There was a sense that smashing the plastic would be like breaking the surface of a pond with your hand and discovering that what lies beneath does not like its mirror breached. Life layered itself back on top of the fear. Halloween came and went. The first hard frost silvered the grass behind the courthouse. The storage unit company finally rented 3 units to a contractor who didn't live in the county and didn't know to ask questions he wouldn't like the answers to. People hugged each other in supermarkets. They argued at the gas station about a new traffic pattern by the high school. The world did what it does, pretending the strange thing is contained when it has only been put in a place where the lights are rarely on. Mallory kept a single page from Morrow's notebook on her refrigerator with a magnet from a diner not in Cleveland, but in Altoona, a magnet shaped like a piece of pie. On that page, Morrow had drawn a staircase with 6 steps and written pauses here, 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 as if the pattern meant something. She found it soothing in a way. She found it good to remind herself that people can name beats even if they cannot stop the measure from playing. When the phone rang once at night and stopped, and her caller ID showed her own number, she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and said to the empty kitchen, "I won't face you." The clock on the microwave ticked 1 minute forward, and nothing else moved. You can hear the story and tell yourself the tape is the villain. You can tell yourself the people who watched it were reckless, arrogant, naive. You can tell yourself you would have locked it away at once and never let it near an outlet again. Maybe you would have. Maybe you wouldn't have. The truth that settled over Mill County like a thin frost was simpler and worse. The tape was not just a thing that captured images and sound. It was a room that learned rooms. It was a staircase that practiced the weight of new feet. It did not swallow people whole. It waited until they answered when it spoke softly from the dark. It took names, the way ivy takes brick, slowly, patiently, without intending harm, the way a plant does not intend, but nevertheless cracking the mortar. There are still drawers at the sheriff's office labeled with neat, patient handwriting. There are still shelves where the lights go on and off on timers. There is still a metal cabinet against the far wall with a log clipped to its front. The cabinet is locked. The key is signed out rarely, always with another person present, always with the accompanying decision to stop at 68 seconds. In the deadest part of night, when the streetlights wash the sidewalk in the color of dishwater and the vending machines click as their compressors switch on, a draft moves along the floor by the evidence cage, and a dispatcher at a desk far down the hall hears a soft, embarrassed tapping on the archives door. If you ever find a cassette at the bottom of a box from a place where the ground remembers footsteps, if you ever read the words "do not watch" written by a hand that pressed too hard with the marker, if you ever feel a stair tread flex under your foot in a house with no stairs, keep your eyes on your own hands. Keep your mouth closed around your own name. Keep the television dark. The tape was locked away for decades, not because the images were obscene, not because the sounds were inadmissible, but because what it learns, it does not forget, and what it says back to you will sound so much like care that you might mistake it for kindness. Don't. When you hear the soft hello in a room that should be empty, answer with silence and walk away while your legs still know your weight. He should have never opened that door. It was late on a Friday night in a quiet town on the outskirts of Pennsylvania. The air felt heavy after a day of rain, and the road that curved past Ashwood Drive shone with a thin black gloss. Porch lights were dim, televisions glowed behind curtains, and a freight train in the distance called out with a low horn that rolled over the roofs like a warning. At the end of the street stood the old boarding house, a brick rectangle with a sagging porch and a doorbell that never worked. Inside that house, a man named Daniel tried to sleep, but sleep had been avoiding him for weeks, and the night had other plans. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Daniel rented a narrow room on the second floor, right above the front door. He worked at a warehouse near the river, sorting shipments that came in long after sunset. He was the quiet type, steady at a job that did not ask questions. He kept a small schedule on his wall, neat and orderly lines with times blocked out for work and meals and the odd call to his sister in Ohio. He did not drink, he did not go out, and he did not believe the stories the tenants traded in the stairwell. The ones about the basement, and the thing that moved in the old crawl space behind the laundry, and the door at the end of the second floor hall that never opened for anyone. At 11:43 p.m., while he was sorting a stack of bills under the glow of his small lamp, the radiator clicked and sighed, the rain ticked at the window, and from the hallway came 3 slow knocks. The sound was hollow and patient. It did not sound like someone calling on a neighbor. It sounded like a rhythm that had started long before he arrived and would continue long after he was gone. He waited. The knocks did not repeat, so he told himself it was the pipes, or the wood, or the wind that rattled the downspout. He stood anyway, as if a string had been tied around his ribs and tugged him toward the door. He opened his room and leaned into the hall. The overhead light's hum buzzed through a yellow haze. The carpet was thin and stained near the edges. At the far end, past the framed exit map and the dusty fire extinguisher, stood a door that matched none of the others. It was a touch taller, a touch narrower, as if it had been measured for another house and shoved into place here, a compromise in wood and paint. He knew the stories, that it was a storage closet, that it was a sealed stairwell, that it did not exist, and everyone else was bored or cruel or both. He also knew that when he first moved in, he counted the doors on both sides on his way to the far end, then counted the windows from the street, and the numbers did not agree. The landlady, Ms. Whitcomb, waved him off with a thin smile. "Old houses have tricks," she said. "Old carpenters make mistakes." He wanted to believe that, so he did, right up until 11:43 p.m. When someone, somewhere, knocked 3 times and asked to be heard. He walked toward it. The carpet gave a tired sigh under each step. When he got close, he smelled damp earth, like a garden shovel pulled from a hole. He touched the knob. It was cold, colder than any metal should be in a hallway with steam heat hissing from a register. He told himself not to turn it. He told himself to go back, lock his own door, and wait until morning. Then he heard a whisper that was hardly a sound at all. He stood very still. The air felt thinner. The lights flickered as if they were trying not to look. He told himself that words can be imagined, that one voice can be another voice in disguise. The whisper came again, almost kind, almost a hum, drawn out through teeth that did not belong to a face he could picture. He turned the knob. The latch slid back without resistance. The door opened an inch and stopped with a tired groan. A draft slid through the gap and brushed his face. It felt like the first breath from an old cellar, or the mouth of a tunnel that had not seen daylight in a very long time. He raised his lamp. The light reached into the opening and touched nothing. No wall, no shelves, no stored paint cans or broom. The darkness did not behave like a shadow. It looked like a place where light did not live. He shut the door. He locked it. He pressed his palm to the frame and felt a tremor pass through the wood, like something unseen had placed its hand there as well. He walked back down the hall and did not run. He closed his room, turned his own lock, and leaned back against the door with his eyes closed. His heart stuttered against his ribs. He told himself he did the right thing. He told himself that he had not actually opened it at all. Then he noticed the smell of damp soil in his room, and he noticed that the wind had stopped, but the curtains still moved. At 12:07 a.m., the knocks returned. Not at the end of the hall, right behind his head. 3 slow raps on his own door. He shouted that it was late, that he would call the police, that whomever it was had the wrong room. The knock stopped. A soft scrape moved down the bottom edge of the door, like fingers feeling along for a seam. He stayed awake until 3:11 a.m., with the lamp on and the window cracked. He woke hours later with his cheek on the desk and light pushing around the shade, like a gentle threat. He almost convinced himself it was a dream until he saw the scrap of paper pinned under his mug. The paper looked ripped from a notebook. He had no notebook like it. 3 words had been written with a blunt pencil. "You let me." He lifted the note with 2 fingers and felt grit on the bottom, tiny grains that looked like sand from a riverbank. He set it down and felt the house breathe. He decided to go to work early. He turned and found the door to his room, not where he left it. He had left it on the wall that faced the hall. Now the wood stood 2 feet to the right, the door frame had moved with it, the paint edges were clean, the old screw holes that should have shown where the hinges lived were gone. For a long moment, he thought he had simply misjudged the distance. Then he stepped back and saw a pale rectangle of wallpaper that had been spared by some old dresser, and the rectangle no longer lined up with anything. He said his own name out loud, the way someone falling says a word to hear a human sound, and he left for work without breakfast. For a few days, he did not touch the far door. He did not walk to the end of the hall. He took the stairs in the back and left by the kitchen because the front porch swayed under a weight he could not see. He heard stories from the others. Nora, on the first floor, said something brushed her ankle while she folded laundry, and no one else was in the room. Jonah, in the smallest room under the attic, said his alarm clock rang at 2:13 a.m. Every night, even when he unplugged it, and one night when it rang, he felt something cold pass over his face, as if it was testing how he breathed. Ms. Whitcomb said the water bill had doubled and no one had taken longer showers. They said these things with the nervous humor of people who want to hear themselves deny what they fear. By the end of the week, the knocks came on the front door at odd hours. 3 deliberate raps and then silence. A delivery showed up with no return address, 1 box of nails, and a hammer that looked like it had been in a fire. The porch light went out and could not be coaxed back to life. When the postman came, he asked if they had started digging in the yard. He said he could smell wet clay when he dropped the mail, and someone had left a shovel leaning against the porch rail. No one owned a shovel like that. The blade had been ground so thin, it flashed like a mirror when the sun cleared the clouds. At 9:26 p.m. on a Monday, he came home to find the hallway colder than the outside air. He reached his room and saw that his lamp was on and his window had been raised, though he remembered very clearly lowering it before he left. He went in and froze. On his bed, placed on the folded blanket as carefully as a gift, lay an old brass key. The teeth were sharp, the bow worn smooth by long use. There was a tag tied to it with a bit of frayed cord. The tag had 2 words written by the same blunt pencil. For you? He held the key and felt a pressure in his ears, as if he had driven up a mountain without noticing. He knew, without any logic, that the key would fit the door at the end of the hall. He also knew that the door had not needed a key when he turned it a week ago. He set the key on the desk and told himself he would ignore it. At 10:01 p.m., his light dimmed, not like a line sagging on the grid, but like a hand placed over a mouth. The key slid across the desk with a soft metallic breath and fell into his palm. He went to the hall and walked to the far door before he could give himself a reason not to. He did not want a reason. He wanted the space between the knocks to end. He pressed the key into the lock. The metal welcomed it. He turned his wrist. The tumblers whispered. The door swung inward without sound. The dark inside pulled at the light in the hall. The bulb did not flicker this time. It simply failed, like an eye that refused to look. He held the door with a shaking hand. He raised his lamp and leaned forward. The air smelled like iron and moss. The floor beyond the threshold did not look level. It tilted down and away, not like a staircase, but like a slope, as if the door opened to a place that was beneath the house and also someplace else. He said hello, then winced at the sound of his own voice. The dark answered with a slow rasp. It sounded like breath pulled across brick. He shut the door and locked it with the key and hung the key on a nail above his bed, determined to prove that he was still the one who decided where things belonged. He did not sleep until dawn laid a smudge of gray across the ceiling. He dreamed with his eyes open and saw a field of doors set into the ground like gravestones. In the dream, he walked between them and counted. He could not finish. The field did not end. The next day, he told himself he would leave. He packed a bag with shirts and socks and the metal photo frame of his parents on a motel patio near Lake Erie. He called his friend Victor, who worked nights as a guard at the warehouse, and asked if he could crash on his couch for a few days. Victor said yes, though he sounded worried by the request, and he told Daniel to arrive after midnight when his shift ended. At 7:15 p.m., Daniel turned his lock, shouldered his bag, and stepped into the hall. He saw fresh footprints on the thin carpet, bare footprints, long and wet, moving away from his door and toward the far end. There were no return prints. At the far door, the footprints faded and stopped. The handle was wet. There was no water anywhere else. He left by the back stairs. The alley behind the house held 2 trash cans and the ghost of a vegetable garden that had never taken. The sky threatened more rain. He cut across 2 blocks toward the bus stop. As he walked, he passed a storefront with a narrow display of lamps and secondhand dishes, and in the glass he saw the reflection of the back of his head. Behind his reflection, though, behind the glass, in the store that should have been locked and dark, he saw a door with a tall, thin frame. It stood where no door should be. It stood the way a finger points in reprimand. He did not turn to look. He kept walking and kept his eyes on the gutter where rain gathered and slithered. He took the late bus. He tried to read. The lights in the bus hummed and dipped. A man, 2 seats back, muttered that everyone should sit down and be quiet, even though everyone was already sitting and no one was talking. Daniel got off near the river where the warehouse stood like a row of gray teeth. He waited for Victor by the back entrance under a buzzing yellow light. At 12:02 a.m., the side door opened and Victor waved him in with a quiet nod. They walked past cages stacked with boxes and the whine of a forklift that was bored with its job. Victor asked if he was all right. Daniel said the house felt wrong and he needed a few days away. Victor said he could stay as long as he wanted, that his couch had a good view of a boring wall, and sometimes a boring view could heal things that moved too fast. They reached the small security office. Daniel set his bag down and leaned against the metal desk. Then he heard it again. 3 slow knocks. Not on the warehouse door, not on a wall. From behind the metal cabinet in the office where no door could hide, Victor heard it too. He narrowed his eyes and walked to the cabinet. The sound came again. 3 knocks that rolled down the metal like water. Victor put a hand on the cabinet and yanked it away from the wall. Behind it was nothing but cinder block, cold gray squares, and mortar like dry bones. Victor swore and shoved the cabinet back. He stood still for a long moment, the way a dog stands when it hears something you cannot. Then the office light blinked and came back, and he looked at Daniel and did not smile. They left together at 2:04 a.m. and walked to the parking lot. The river moved like heavy glass. A fog bank drifted near the pilings. Victor drove while Daniel watched the rearview mirror. Streetlights passed in even intervals. On the 3rd light, Daniel realized that each time the car rolled under the glow, he saw a tall black rectangle standing in the reflection, as if a door had been placed behind the back seat and bent the mirror as it passed. He did not look back. He watched the mirror and kept his hands flat on his thighs. Victor lived in a basement apartment under a dentist office on Maple Street. The walk down the short set of steps felt like a dive. The air smelled like coffee grounds and old magazines. The couch faced a small television and a shelf of paperbacks. Daniel sat and tried to slow his breathing. At 3:11 a.m., the sound came from the hallway outside, the simple and terrible shape of 3 knocks, and Victor went to the door with a baseball bat and flung it open. The hallway was empty. A draft slipped over his shoes and ran past Daniel on the couch as if something had been waiting to be invited. Victor shut the door and slid the chain and stood with his mouth open, then walked to the couch and put the bat down and said they would get a priest or a contractor in the morning. He did not care which. Morning did not help. The day stood gray and slack. Victor called a cousin who knew a handyman, who knew a carpenter, who had a story about a walled-up passage in a row house in Reading. The carpenter came at 1:02 p.m. with a belt of tools and a calm face. He listened while Daniel said what he could. He nodded the way people nod when they decide to accept things so they can move toward the part where they fix it. He went to the old boarding house with them. He stood at the end of the 2nd floor hall and looked at the tall, thin door that waited without impatience. He took a small square of mirror from his pocket and held it in the opening when Daniel turned the key and moved the door a few inches. The carpenter watched the mirror with a still face. The mirror did not show darkness. The mirror did not show anything. It did not show the hall behind them. It stayed blank. He closed the mirror and said that sometimes there are doors that are not doors, sometimes there are holes that were not dug, and sometimes a house is built over something that does not agree. He ran his palm down the frame and felt where the wood had been sanded, then scarred, then sanded again. He said there was an old story in towns like this about a set of steps with 11 risers and a 12th riser made of empty space. People would count and be satisfied, then put a foot down and fall where there was no step. He said there were also stories about men who bricked up their sins and slept sound after, until one night the mortar breathed. He set his bag down and took out a pouch of salt and a small mason line and a chalk plum. He had learned the habit from a mason who drank black coffee at dawn and swore that chalk lines remember the world the way it should be. He hung the plum by the frame, the string shook, the weight turned slow circles and would not settle. He asked for a hammer. Daniel brought the burned one from the porch, untouched since the delivery. The carpenter frowned at the black marks on the handle and did not use it. He used his own. He set 3 screws into the frame and 3 into the door and tied them to the line. He ran salt along the threshold until it looked like surf. He told Daniel to leave the door closed, locked, and tied, and to keep a light burning through the night so he could see if the line broke. He said he would return in the morning with a proper plate and a brace. He said to call if the salt moved. He stepped back and looked weary suddenly, like the room had taken a small bite of him, and he left with a quiet nod. At 2:09 a.m., Daniel woke to a soft hiss. He sat up and saw the salt rolling back from the threshold as if an invisible tide was pulling it inward. The string shook. The screws sang, a tiny metal whine like a sound a child could hear when a television is on. He stood and held the key and did not know what to do. The strings snapped with 3 sharp tings. The screws turned. The door eased open, not toward him, but toward the dark that hungrily accepted it. He might have turned and run. He did not. He pressed the door closed with both hands and braced his feet and felt something on the other side pushing back with a slow, patient strength. He said, "Please stop." He did not even know to whom he spoke. The pressure eased. He turned the key. He leaned his forehead against the paint and stayed there until light began to creep around the window shade like a spy. He called the carpenter at 7:04 a.m. The call rang and rang. He left a message and waited. He called again, no answer. At noon, he walked to the corner store to buy coffee and bread and found a small crowd gathered by the alley. A police cruiser sat with its lights quiet but its engine running. 2 officers stood near a man on the ground with a sheet over his chest. The sheet was bright white against his boots that stuck out one end. A neighbor said the man had been found at dawn, stretched out near the dumpster, with a look like a person who left a task unfinished. Daniel felt the world narrow. He asked a woman in a scarf if she knew who it was. She said the man had a belt of tools on the curb. A leather pouch lay beside it with salt in the seams. A plumb bob sat under the bumper of a dirty sedan. Daniel said he needed air and he walked until he could not see the alley anymore. He did not return to the boarding house until evening. The door at the end of the hall waited. His own door stood where it should be now, as if the house had grown tired of the joke. He tried to pack again. He put the key in his pocket and told himself he would toss it into the river on the walk to the bus. As he zipped his bag, the room breathed cold. The window lowered by itself an inch and shut with a soft kiss. The lamp dimmed and brightened and dimmed again. He heard the knock. 3 steady raps, not from the hall, not from his door, but from inside his closet. He opened it with a small sound in his throat that could have been a laugh. The closet smelled like cedar and mothballs. An old coat that belonged to a tenant who never came back brushed his arm. The back of the closet did not hold a wall anymore. It held a tall, thin door, the same shape, the same handle. His head swam. He closed the closet and leaned his back against it and said the words he had read on the note. "You let me." He left that night at 10:27 p.m. He did not turn off the lamp. He did not lock his room. He went down the front steps where the porch sagged and turned left. The street looked longer than it ever had. He reached the corner and stopped. A man stood beneath the big sycamore that tilted over the curb. The man wore a coat that hung like a curtain. He faced away. He lifted a hand without moving his shoulder and knocked gently on the air in front of him. 1, 2, 3. The sound traveled to Daniel as if it had been made on wood near his ear. The man lowered his hand and walked across the street without looking left or right. He moved like a sleepwalker. Daniel took a step back. He went the other direction toward the church where the lights were always on for a little while after the hour. He did not pray. He sat in the last pew and watched the red exit sign burn like a coal and listened to the building creak as if it also had a spine and a set of tired ribs. The next morning, a city inspector arrived after a call that came from no one they could later identify. He wore a jacket with a seal and carried a clipboard with forms attached by a rusty clip. He walked through the house and looked at wiring and pipes and the water heater that rattled when it started. He reached the second floor. He paused at the end of the hall. He looked at the tall, narrow door as if reading a note in a language he almost remembered. He tried the handle. It did not turn. He wrote something on his form and left. On the way out, he told Ms. Whitcomb that old houses collect strange corners, and sometimes those corners collect a smell, and sometimes the smell is not a real smell but a memory of one. She nodded and smiled with her lips only. When he had gone, she climbed the stairs with a hammer and nails and a square of plywood. She stood at the door and waited. She did not raise the hammer. She walked back to her office and called a number she kept in a small book. No one answered that number either. The days after that did not break into clear pieces. Time smudged. He slept in fits. He saw the key in places he did not leave it. On his pillow, in the sink, inside his shoe like a small tongue. He took it to the river and threw it hard. It struck the water with a plunk that felt too small for the weight it carried. He watched the ripple widen and then close like a wound. He walked home and found the key sitting on his desk with the cord tied into a neat bow, as if someone with patient fingers had waited years to learn such a simple knot. Victor stopped by at 8:31 p.m. with 2 coffees and a man from his church who read quietly from a small book and asked to walk through the house with them. The man did not announce anything. He did not demand or command. He listened. He stood in the hall at the far door and said the place felt like a mouth pressed shut. He walked to the basement. The basement had a low ceiling and a strip of dirt floor near the far wall, where an old support post sank like a stake. The man crouched and touched the dirt and rose with a look of distant thought. He said he did not think the house was haunted in the simple way people like to say. He thought the house had been built over a path, like a country lane that had once run from one field to another. The lane did not end when the field was plowed. It kept going under what came after. He said some paths want travelers, some doors want to be used. He said someone long ago had opened a door here and did not shut it correctly. He said someone had tried to build a wall where a door did not want to be. He said none of this was about belief. It was about the shape of a wound and the way it will not close if a piece of it is missing. He asked Daniel what he had heard first. A knock, Daniel said. 3 knocks. The man nodded. He said 3 knocks are polite. They are the old way. They mean a traveler is asking permission. He said the worst thing you can do is open the door when the traveler has asked, and you do not know who it is. If you open, you become a host. If you refuse, the traveler goes on. He looked at Daniel with eyes that had watched factory smoke for years and said that sometimes the host does not know he has become one until the first guest is already in the kitchen. That night, Daniel tried to follow orders. He placed the key in a bowl of salt. He drew a line of chalk across the threshold of his room and across the far door. He set a chair under the knob. He sat and waited. At 1:03 a.m., the chair slid quietly aside and settled a foot away, as if a careful hand had pushed it and did not want to scratch the floor. The chalk line broke without footsteps crossing it. The key rose an inch in the bowl and rested again as if nodding. The door in the hall did not move. The closet door inside his room did. He heard a breath, slow and deliberate, in a space that could not hold anyone. The breath did not rush. It took its time. It sounded like a tide that had finally decided which way it meant to go. He left a recording on his phone for whoever might come next. He spoke into the small microphone with his voice pulled tight. He said he was sorry for whatever he had done, even if all he had done was turn the knob of a door in a hallway that should have been boring. He said he did not believe in curses. He said he believed in mistakes. He said he felt like a man who had signed a contract written in invisible ink. He left the phone on the desk with the recording playing on repeat, like a small litany. In the morning, the landlady knocked on his room and called his name. He did not answer. She opened the door and stepped in and felt a chill ripple her skirt. The lamp was on, the bed was unmade. The phone on the desk whispered the last line of his recording over and over in a thin loop. I did not mean to let you in. The closet stood open 2 inches. The far door at the end of the hall stood open a foot. A line of damp soil ran from the far door to the closet and stopped dead at the sill. The bowl of salt sat empty with a faint ring near its lip, as if something with many small hands had taken its measure. The police came and did what police do. They cataloged, they measured, they took photographs that flattened the room into rectangles and squares. Officer Nolan walked down to the basement and stared at the strip of dirt and came back up and wrote that the ground smelled like a place beside a river after a flood. He stood by the far door and looked into the dark that did not show the hall reflected in his pupils, and he decided to step away. The report said missing person. The report said no sign of forced entry. The report said the tenant had been under stress. The report did not say that Nolan woke that night at 3:11 a.m. in his own home to the sound of 3 polite knocks that came from inside the linen closet, and he lay still until the knocks moved on like a traveling show. Weeks passed without weeks passing at all. A new tenant toured the building and said he liked old wood and cheap rent. He took Daniel's room. He lasted 3 nights. He left a note under the rent box that said sorry and 2 jackknives on the table as if the color of their handles had been a promise he wanted to keep. A woman who taught at the middle school moved into Nora's old space and smiled at the stairwell like an actress who believes in second chances. She told a colleague that the house hummed like a distant generator even when the power was steady. She told no one that her alarm shifted to 2:13 a.m. and stayed there no matter how she set it. She left during a rain on a Tuesday afternoon with a single backpack and a plant under her arm that shook as if a breeze was in the hall, but there was no breeze in the hall. The landlady started to sleep on a cot in the office downstairs because the phones rang without calls, and she decided she would rather be the first to hear than the last. She opened the ledger and ran a finger down the old page where the house deeds were copied out for no good reason except that someone had liked the look of handwriting. She found an entry about a previous owner who had poured concrete in the crawl space and then broken it up with a sledge when the water would not run right. She found another entry about a boarder who spoke to the wall in the laundry room and said the wall spoke back with a voice like a voice in a metal pipe. She closed the ledger and told herself stories about plumbing and air and a bad memory that walks in circles. At dawn, she raised the blinds and found a small brass key on the windowsill with a tag that said, "For you." She went very still and did not touch it until noon when she put on a pair of gloves and used 2 fingers to flick it into the trash. She took the trash out to the can and set the lid and walked inside and locked the back door. When she returned to the office, the key sat on the desk with the cord in a new bow that no one had tied. On a night with a clear sky and a slow moon, a group of teenagers dared one another to throw pebbles at the boarding house and run. They stood under the sycamore and whispered the way teenagers do. They were not cruel. They only wanted to feel their hearts rise. They crept along the fence and raised their arms, and at that exact moment, a soft knocking sound came from the fence itself. 3 polite raps that carried the texture of wood, though the fence was iron. They broke and ran. All but one who stood with his mouth open like a fish, because at the end of the second-floor hall, a door was open, and in the dark behind it, a figure stood. The figure looked tall, but also wrong, as if the lines of the body had been drawn with a rule that did not match the human sketch. The figure raised a hand, the knock came again. The boy ran so fast, he left his shoes. A year did not pass because we will not count years. The house gathered dust in the places no one cleaned. The porch leaned a little more. The door at the end of the second floor hall sometimes stood ajar for no one, and sometimes closed itself with a courtesy that felt like a joke. When a storm rolled up the valley, the house held its breath, and the lights in the kitchen flickered and stilled, and for a moment, the hum of the refrigerator showed its true note, and you could hear the shape of something that had been here longer than wires or motors or rain. Detective Reed, who was older than his haircut and younger than his eyes, stopped by every few months to ask if anyone had heard from the missing tenant. He stood at the foot of the stairs and looked like a man waiting for a train that would never come to this platform. He took notes that he did not keep. He asked the same questions. He did not ask about doors. One day, he sat alone in his sedan outside the house and watched the second floor windows for an hour. At 3:11 p.m., when the street was quiet and a dog barked twice and then thought better of it, he saw a shape slide past the far window and pause. The shape did not move like a shadow made by a person. It moved like the afterimage in your eye when you stare at a light and then look away. He started the engine and drove to the municipal lot and sat with his head in his hands until the sensation passed that a set of steps was missing beneath his feet and he would fall if he tried to stand. There are people who believe they are too practical to be lost. They do not understand that a path that runs under a house has no use for belief. The door at the end of the hall is still there. Most days it is only wood and paint, holding the quiet air of a staircase that does not exist. Some nights it is not only wood. On those nights, the hallway feels longer than it did at noon. The bulb burns with a halo. The carpet nap looks pressed in the shape of feet that stood and waited. When you stand there, if you are foolish enough to stand there, you will feel the air lean toward you. It will feel like the moment a stranger steps too close on a bus, polite and invasive at the same time. You will hear nothing at first. Then you will hear 3 knocks. Then you will hear a voice that speaks like a man who will not raise his voice because he does not need to. People who live far away will say that doors do not work that way. They will say a story is a way for a house to make sense of its creaks. They will say a man named Daniel had a bad week and made a bad choice and then made another. They will be right and wrong in equal measure. What is true is this: he should have never opened that door. He did anyway. He did a simple thing, and the world made of wood and light and time turned a few quiet degrees. We do not always see the turn. We feel it. We wake at 2:13 a.m. because an old clock in an old place has decided that is the right time for a soft hand to try a knob. We hear 3 knocks that are polite because the old ways are more patient than we are. We tell ourselves to ignore them. We do. We do not. We stand up and walk to the hall and place our fingers on a piece of metal that is colder than it should be, and we turn and we learn that some doors do not open into rooms, they open into unfinished invitations. On certain quiet mornings, the landlady pauses at the mailboxes and believes she hears someone at the end of the hall speaking very softly. She thinks she hears a man apologizing. She thinks she hears him say he did not mean to be a host. She stands very still and swallows, and the sound goes away. She does not tell anyone. She checks the keys on the hook. There is one more key than there should be. She does not touch it. She turns the sign on the front door to no vacancy, even when she has 2 rooms free. She tells herself it is for safety. She tells herself that boarding houses work best when they are a little empty. She tells herself that one day she will take a hammer to that far door and break it into a pile of obedient boards. She tells herself many things. At 11:43 p.m., on nights when the rain moves sideways, she hears 3 slow knocks and looks up from her chair, and for a second, one small second that stretches, she thinks she will answer. If you visit Ashwood Drive and you stand under the sycamore and you look at the second floor window at the end of the hall, you might see nothing but the tired curtains sagging inward as if the house is swallowing. Or you might see a thin line darker than the rest, the seam of a door that is not quite shut. You might hear a knock even if there is no wood within reach. You will be tempted to knock back. People are tempted by small rituals. Do not do it. Walk away while you can, walk to the corner, and do not look at your reflection in the storefront glass. If you do, you may notice a tall black rectangle standing where no door should be, and you may learn the trick too late. The trick is not that the door follows you. The trick is that once you have opened it, there is no place left where it is not. The house stands and waits. The train still calls with its low horn. The porch light still fails and returns when it wants. People still move in and out with boxes and hope. They tell one another that every town has a story like this. They say the names wrong and get the times mixed up. None of that matters. The rhythm is what matters. 3 slow knocks, a pause, 3 more. The whisper that sounds like breath pulled across brick. The cold metal of a knob at the end of a short walk that can take the rest of your life. The way a man speaks at the edge of a choice and thinks he has time to think. The way a door waits forever and never gets tired. He should have never opened that door. He did. And now, on certain nights when the air is wet and the street is quiet and the hum of the wires makes your teeth buzz, you can stand very still and you will feel it. The world has a seam in it. Someone is on the other side of that seam with their knuckles raised, and they are polite, and they are patient, and they are calling on anyone who still believes a door is only wood